You're live.
Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight Bre and I are talking with Greg Laden and Sciencey Melly. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Hey everyone. Hey Bre, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing great tonight. I'm glad to be here. Excited to talk about primates. I understand we're going to have some chimpanzee talk, and they're going to talk about some forensic studies, and we're going to meet this meeting of the minds here between primatology and forensics. I can't wait.
Oh, it's awesome. I get to get my geek on. I want everyone to know I've been having internet issues, so if I pop out, Bre is a very capable host and will make you feel welcome. And we'll just hope that I keep on for as long as possible. So let's bring on our guest. We have Sciencey Melly. Hello, Sciencey Melly.
Hi. How are y'all doing?
Doing good. My internet, not so much, but thank you for coming back on the show because I really loved having you on.
Anytime. I was super excited to come back on. So happy y'all.
And of course, we have Greg. I don't know if it's Laden. How do you pronounce your last name?
It's Laden, just like Osama.
Okay. Osama didn't they? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How have you been?
I've been okay. We have our first solid 10-day period without snow.
Wow.
And starting today, we are no longer going to have temperatures below freezing, I'm told by our weather experts. So that's good. We had a very, very late in Minnesota. We had a very late running, very snowy. You know, people hear about Minnesota, they assume it's cold and snowy. It's really not. It's cold, and we also get snow. This year we had a lot of snow, like almost third snowiest winter on record where I live.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
We had just the opposite. We usually have at least one good snow, but usually it comes in waves. Mm-hmm. We had nothing this winter.
Yeah.
So climate change for you. Yeah, where he's at. It's unseasonably wet, and you're unseasonably dry, and that's what we should expect to see. A lot of out of whack weather that drives sensitive species into extinction too. You know, the golden toad famously extinct due to what they believe was El Nino event. So yeah, it's wild what a little change of weather can do.
We're going to have another El Nino coming up, as I understand it, starting late summer, winter. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yes. Well, let's talk about some of these wonderful animals that we don't want to see going extinct by an El Nino, or human intervention of any kind. So, Bre, you were talking about, you said chimpanzees. Isn't that what you said?
Yeah, I heard mention of chimpanzees backstage, and I was excited to hear more about that.
Yes, I'm excited to hear more about that. So, first, we were talking a little bit, or I overheard y'all talking a little bit backstage about what you were actually getting your degree in, Sciencey Melly, and then what your PhD was in, Greg. And so, could you tell a little bit about your background, each of you, and then we'll jump into our conversation. How about you start, Sciencey? Or Melly?
Sure. Whichever one at this point. I answer to both. So basically, I am currently a student at the University of Texas at Austin, like Lawrence. I'm very excited about that. And I study biochemistry and forensic sciences. So my main thing is, while I know a bit about biological anthropology, I am more the connection point between biological anthropology and what I use it for now. So on the forensic side, how it's used and how we can use it to identify different skeletons and identify people from those skeletons. So
very cool. And Greg, how about you?
Yeah, well, my background is in I took a long time to get my PhD thesis and did a lot of different kinds of things. So I have like equivalent of four PhD theses almost. But the bioanthro part was mainly to focus on I spent time living in what was then Zaire with the FA Pygmies, and I studied how they use the landscape and how their extraction of resources from the landscape changes the availability and abundance of resources. So what they're doing is increasing resources that they use. They actually enhance them and increase them by using them. And a few other aspects of their so looking at dispersal of fruit and so on. But while I was doing that work, I was getting my PhD with people who are very much into chimpanzees and other primates and paleoevolution. So I ended up linking together I discovered that the FA pygmies seasonally use underground storage organs of plants in ways that we hadn't expected them to do. And while I was doing that work in one part of Zaire, some other people, you know about the Virunga volcanoes and the gorillas, Diane Fossey. Okay. People working in that area with chimpanzees that I had met out there had discovered that those chimpanzees were the only chimpanzees they knew about that were actually digging something up and using it. No other chimpanzees were digging anything up and using that. And what they were doing is they were digging up roots to get water during the time of year that they didn't otherwise have access to water. Meanwhile, I was looking at some early hominin sites and noticed that there's a marker fossil called Tachyrichtes, which is a rodent that shows up at a certain point in time. So marker fossil, because we know it comes from Asia into Africa at a certain approximate year, give or take 100,000 years. And it was a really unusual looking rodent. And I was looking through a Barry Leakey's monograph on Olduvai Gorge, and I saw the complete basic cranium of a robust Australopithecine. And as I paged, I lost track of the picture. And I stopped and thought, sorry, this is on Olduvai Gorge. This is on Laetoli, the African site Laetoli. And I realized Laetoli does not have any skulls of any kind. So I went back looking and I found out I had mistaken the picture of a rodent for a hominin. And I realized that looks like a hominin. Even though I now know it's a rodent, it still looks like a hominin. I came back from the field and I didn't have a place to live. I ended up staying that happened every year. I ended up staying at my friend Irv's house, Irv DeVore, the guy who invented hunter-gatherer studies. I was staying at his house. And another guy named Richard Wrangham, you may have heard of, was also back from the field, and he didn't have a place to stay. So we were sitting around in Irv's living room talking, and we put together an idea in which we realized that the thing that made the ancestor of chimpanzees and human beings split into two species was that chimpanzees, which use leaves as a fallback food, shifted to using roots as a fallback food, which changes their anatomy of their heads in ways that we see in that rodent, which lives exclusively off of roots. So what we did in this theory was to explain the chimp-human split. And I'm really happy about this because this was years ago when I wrote a paper, and Wrangham was a second author on the chimp-human split. And it's gotten into textbooks and people teach it. And no one has really refuted it. The evidence of root eating is strong. And whether it was really the split that caused it was caused by this, or whether it was something that simply became characteristic of our ancestors for 2 million years is a little unclear. But if you look at our early Australopithecine ancestors, they have root-eating heads. And this might sound like, so what, right? Well, of all the primates, there's only one other primate that eats roots living. Among mammals, there's hardly any mammals that eat roots. You might not be surprised to learn that fish don't eat roots. I wouldn't be surprised if there was one in the Amazon. Birds don't eat roots. Of the vertebrates, of the tetrapods, there are no amphibians that eat roots. There are no lizards that eat roots. So of the tetrapods, only a few eat roots. And among the few, they're mammals. And among the mammals, there aren't many. And among the mammals, there's bears and suids, pigs, and 2 species of primates, we being one. So it's an entire ecology of food that is pretty much entirely eaten by nematodes and worms and funguses and bacteria, and not animals with bones. So when our ancestors tapped into that, it was like a whole new niche and created the explosion of species. And it's a nice theory of everything. It might be wrong, but that's where the chimpanzee human thing comes in for me.
That's so
You
cool.
know, that's brilliant layout of kind of a syllogism on ancestry, right? You could make a similar kind of thing about the split from the rest of the other eucontoglires, like when they started eating insects, right?
Exactly. There's this whole new resource there, and then boom, all this stuff happens. And also, I like telling the story to students about how we figured it out, because it's a story about how science works.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't sit there and come up with a sterile hypothesis. I made a mistake. I mistook a rodent for a primate. That's a stupid mistake. I was out in the field. It was really funny. I was out in the field in a different place than my pygmy work was. And a car comes by. There's no cars there. Car comes by. And this person gets out. There's no people there. And it's an American. There's no Americans there. And she comes over and she's got cameras on her. Like, she looks like a Gary Larson character, almost. Like, here I am with my cameras. And I said, what are you doing here? I said, well, it was an American. And she said, well, I'm actually here. I'm on my way to such and such place to habituate the chimps. So I said, what do you mean? I said, well, these chimps, no one has studied these chimps yet. And you got to hang out with them for like a year with like taking pictures. And then they get used to it. They don't run away as much. That was a chimp group that Wrangham later found out were eating these.
Moving towards that niche.
Yeah. And the thing is, one person related to this project running to another person related to this project in a place where there are no people was just impossible. That couldn't have happened. Yet it did happen.
Yeah.
So it was all very weird and strange.
All work together, just timing and everything. And those were bonobos or chimps, or
those are just regular chimps.
Regular chimps.
Yeah.
Did you see the trackway while you were there? Just curious.
No, I did not. I've never been to Laetoli, and I did. There was this moment in time. It was pretty interesting when I was just graduated, and the Leakey Foundation and the Tanzanian government jointly put out a request to get someone to go, and Laetoli had been excavated a long time earlier, and it was deteriorating. So they got people. They wanted to get someone to go in and be in charge of saving it and preserving it. It's on Maasai land, so you can't. The Maasai want to be able to move their cattle around and not be interfered with. Yet they respect the resource. It's an incredibly important national treasure. So they were looking for a sacrificial anthropologist to go and be in charge. And I was on a short list of about 5 or 6 people to do that job. And I remember thinking, after talking to more people, I really don't want this job.
Just curating the site, like a lifetime gig of curating the site, huh?
It might have been, we're getting it to the point of preservation. It might have been ultimately burying it, which I eventually did bury a lot of it.
Yeah.
The person who got the job was a Kenyan who was working in, I think it was Kenyan, who was living in here. So anyway, in Tanzania, it was an East African person who was of European ancestry, ended up with a job, and she did a very good job of it. But it would have been a very difficult, because it was bad. Someone had earlier buried it with dirt, and roots came in, and ironically, and were breaking it apart, breaking the trackway apart. So it was really pretty bad.
That's so cool. It's interesting because I had heard, oh gosh, it's been years ago, that the thing that started that rift was actually fire, like being able to cook food, and so I wonder, do you feel that maybe it's the two of those things combined, or?
Yeah, definitely. That was okay. So we did this research project and continued on with our lives. And at a later time, Richard Wrangham came to me, same guy, and we're in the same department, down the hall from each other. He came to me and he said, I don't understand how you anthropologists, he's a primate guy, right? How you paleoanthropologists don't understand that the most significant thing that ever happened in human evolution must be that we tripled in size. Right? So biologists looking at a species tripling in size is like, why don't you explain that? Why is that not what you are explaining? You're trying to explain bipedalism. Who cares? Explain why human ancestors go from being Australopithecines are 3.5 feet tall, okay, to being 5.5 feet tall. Yeah. And that's over tripling a mess. Okay, explain that. That's the biggest biological signal he'd ever seen in evolution. So I pointed out, Richard, that's true, but it's also true that we went from being 3-to-1 male to female body size to being almost the same body size, males and females, in early Homo erectus. He said, that's another biological signal. Explain that. So over a period of a few weeks, we got together some more people, including David Pilbeam and Jamie he's a guy, I can't remember his name, the guy at Stanford now, Jamie Jones, and a couple other people, Nancy Lou Cochran, the food person. And so we all sat down and thought about it for a long time and did some research. And that's where the fire thing comes along. We realized that the big increasing in size is because suddenly, just like finding all those roots makes you have more food, discovering fire and being able to cook everything that you couldn't before eat increases your body size. Including the roots. Because, the roots, a lot of them are poisonous and you got to cook them. So it's like, oh, we have roots now, but we can't eat a lot of them. And now we can eat them all because most roots are. So anyway, there's always the same research team that proposed fire, but it's later, it's the origin of our genus, Homo.
Is there inverse correlation between jaws? Because I think roots, the big jaw, right? And then that jaw reduces as we get fire because we can cook it and it's softer now. And there's like a correlation. We got 3 times bigger, but our jaw is like 3 times smaller compared to our body mass.
Exactly. That's a weird thing. Like, how do you get so much bigger and have a smaller mouth? What the heck is that, right? How do you do that? So that's exactly correct. And by the way, roots are digested in the mouth. The amylase enzymes in the mouth are what digest root starch.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
So you chew them, then swallow them. So those big teeth and big faces are for chewing roots forever, like for hours and hours a day.
That's why you have to grind a carrot for so long when you're eating a carrot.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
Processing it.
I want to hear more from Melly. What you do? What are you doing with your forensic stuff? What do you do? Like, do you actually work on stuff now, on actual cases yet? Are you doing that?
I cannot right now because I don't have like the degree on hand yet. So since I'm still a student, it's very, very hard to get forensics internships, and that's kind of like the pain in the butt of it all.
Right.
But I have like, gone around a few morgues and stuff, kind of had a little go at just kind of mirroring or shadowing people. And so you learn a lot in those areas. And so it's very, very fun and fascinating, but I absolutely cannot wait to finally use it for the like field work and for the crime scene investigation side that I want to get into. So
are you okay with dead bodies and dead people spells?
Yeah. So at some point you kind of just get used to it, and you're like, okay, this is like, I have to do certain things to get certain answers, and you kind of treat it just like, it's like any cadaver, really. Like, you take the humanism out of it after a certain point, and then like, because it just saves your sanity.
Yeah, I had a student years ago who was lucky because she went into forensics before as many people did. So as a just graduate undergraduate, she did a project with me on forensics. She got a job in Florida, and because of her political and family circumstances, I ended up becoming kind of her confidant. She was sending me like a diary every week of what she was doing. So I was hearing her experiences. And when she got there, they hated her. She was a girl, didn't like girls, very sexist.
No, they really still hate us, honestly.
Yeah. And also, she was a northerner in an interior Florida little hick town. So she was now, and she was going to do science, and that was going to like, we do police work here, right?
Yeah.
And so they gave her this box and said, here's a skeleton, figure it out. So she figured out not who the person was, but everything she could about the person from the skeleton.
Yeah.
And it was everything they had down was wrong about the person's like race, age, etc. And once they matched it up, they were able to identify the remains.
Yeah. In fact, the last time I was on this show, I was actually explaining a little bit to Bre and Sunny the identification process with especially skulls and things like that, and how it's very, once you get into like the mode of it and you kind of have it down, it's very, very easy to identify like a biological sex from like a skeleton as well as race from a skeleton. It's very fun too. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. As a part of our oral exam when I was teaching at Harvard, the undergraduate bioethicists they get an oral exam, and I had a skull which has now been repatriated, but it's a skull that has at the base of it had mastoid processes that resembled Inuit, and it had teeth that looked African, with a just in terms of the incisors, and it had other features that were clearly Asian. The rest of the skull was mostly Asian, and we'd ask to identify it, and we couldn't possibly identify it, but because it was actually somebody who just isn't found in North America. Like it only works if you have to subset that exists, right? This is an Andean person, and it didn't look like anything you find in North America normally. And then the next question was cause of death, and there was actually a copper cylindrical spearhead in its right into its brain, probably the cause of death. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, wow. We have a question, and hopefully my internet will stay long enough for me to read this. How important is teeth to identifying a body?
Very. It's not the only important thing, but of course it's really important, at least to me, because we get skulls a lot of the time. Like whenever we're doing things in our forensics classes, we'll get skulls. We haven't really you don't just get a random arm bone most of the time. Like your professor's not just going to give you that. It's typically skulls. And so you can tell, for one, the biological sex, because thank God humans are sexually dimorphic, meaning that like we look different based off of what biological sex we are. So most of the time, if it's like the skull is male, they will have like a bigger teeth and a wider jaw than a female skull. Now, this isn't like always like foolproof, just because, a lot of the time, like I look more masculine than like my roommate type thing, but it's pretty accurate most of the time. Not to mention, whenever it comes to like finding out race and things like that, you also have to use parts of the skull, including the teeth. So like those two are very, very big indicators in identifying a skull and identifying who a person is.
So with overlap between different people groups, I always use the term haplogroups because I'm always looking at the genetic stuff, but when we're doing comparative anatomy like what you're talking about, is there more of a variation between people groups or between sexes? And are there sexes where the development of the skull of the groups intersect or overlap where you wouldn't be able to make those kind of determinations?
I'm still a beginner, so truthfully, at some points I am very bad at making those determinations whenever I've been given some skulls in my classes. But like overall, it's pretty like I've gotten better at it, and it's pretty identifiable with biological sexes. With races, it comes down to a few more factors whenever we're like doing our identifying like sheet and stuff like that. But it's definitely easier for me to like identify biological sexes.
Yeah, that's a good question because it exposes a real nuance in. I know that this is not forensics, but in terms of bioanthro, there's different populations have different degrees of sexual dimorphism. So there are some groups of people where it's very minimal. Now, the thing is, what you do with remains in North America only involves the people who live here. And fortunately, North America does not uniformly sample the entire. Fortunately, from the point of view of forensics, North America does not represent everybody in the world, although it does more than most countries. It does more than most countries. Go look at the Olympics.
Oh.
You can tell what team a country is from, unless they're from the United States.
Honestly, it's very like now this is an issue with academia, especially with like the forensics field. It is still very like Eurocentric a lot of the time. So whenever like we typically don't get like indigenous like skulls or anything like that. So it's very much easier to identify like biological sexes with a very Eurocentric like ideal in mind in comparison to like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions really quickly. I'm going to try to throw these in real quick. One is from Aunt Jer. What would destroy teeth?
Acid.
That's a simple answer. That's good.
I mean, a lot of things, but like acidic things will, the more acidic it is, the like it'll typically, acid will go for destroying like calcium and calcium bases in the body along with other things. And then bases will typically destroy like tissue and proteins.
Right, the next question. What about the size of a skull? Do Black people in Africa really have a smaller cavity in their cranium? Dr. Greg will know, as believed in the bell curve. This is a great question because this is well, go ahead.
Yeah, we could do a whole thing on this. I think Skeptic Haven knows that this is one of my areas of expertise and interest. So the story works like this. The early scientists who looked at this, especially were Germans in the 19th century, and they measured all kinds of skulls. And the first thing they found out was when you look at the inside of the brain size of skulls from all different parts of the world, is that they don't vary much. They found out that everybody's skulls are about the same. Males are bigger than females. And they did find they had one Eskimo skull and it was like huge. The brain size was giant. And other than that one skull, everybody's kind of the same. And we see that in this various 19th century records. And then some scientists started taking the same data and changing the way they measured things. And they discovered then that Europeans had the biggest brains, according to the new methods of measuring things. And then one scientist in particular, who was a Canadian, is now we're getting into the 20th century, found new ways of measuring things. And in that case, he found that African brains are really tiny compared to European brains, which are really huge. So when we look back now at how those changes worked, how they measured them, what this guy who was Rushton, what he did was he figured you got to make sure he got data that was from the outside of the skull, how big is the circumference of the skull, and he'd interpolate the size of the brain. In order to do that, he had a formula, and the formula did various things. And one of the things it did was it subtracted the thickness of the skull. Okay, so he had some data that showed to him that Asians had thinner skulls than Europeans. Europeans had slightly thicker skulls. The data was from the data was from hats. Okay, so it's a World War I. They're conscripting American soldiers. They're giving them hats. So you know how big around the hat is. So you just like how many big hats, medium-sized hats, and small hats you give out. So you get an estimate of and then you know whether they're black or white soldiers because it was a segregated army. And then in Thailand, they also did something with measuring heads for the military. So they had a Asian, it was all Thai heads. Okay, so these are hats. You subtract the skull, you get the brain. But the African skulls, he used European measurements. There are lots of European skulls. He used Asian measurements. There are lots of Asian skulls. He only had one African skull, and it was actually not a modern human. It was an archaic Homo sapiens that had a really thick skull. Not only did it have a really thick skull, but it had the thickest skull that has ever been measured on a hominin ever. He took the most extreme case of a different species, and he used that to subtract the brain size of all of the Africans. And that's called racist science. You might call it race science because studying race, but that's why we see, and that's what the bell curve uses. The famous Murray and Herrnstein book, The Bell Curve, they use Rushton's research. It's an appendix in the back of the book, and that's the basis of his research. I can go more detail on how that all works, but it's just amazing how you just imagine a bunch of data showing everyone's skull is about the same, and then the data starts to show Africans smaller, Europeans bigger, and then it gets smaller and bigger, they get smaller and bigger. You look back, and then they add some data, but it's really the same data set being adjusted again and again by a racist scientist in Canada. We wouldn't expect to see that in Canada, but that's where he was.
Can we just like talk about the amount of racism in science real quick? Like it's ridiculous. I've been going down this this spiral of hyperfixation over race and science correlation. The thing is that whenever you are like in your undergrad and you're going into a science field, you are taught multiple times, like textbook wise, that race technically does not exist within the world of science. because just it's a human concept. It's a social concept. But whenever people bring it back in because because of course we are humans and we do have a social science within, our society, like that involves racism. And so a lot of times whenever you're reading these studies, it boggles my mind how many studies like correlate with just feeding into racist ideology. It's crazy. Like I'm going into this because I had a full-on hyperfixation like research mode for the past like 2 weeks over like melanin and skin pigmentation, and it all started because I got a sunburn and I wanted to know all about it. And so now it's the amount of published articles that I have read where it involved some sort of racist like backing or some sort of racist goal is crazy.
Yeah,
Are those
he really-
older studies, or is that even modern stuff?
One of them was a 2004 study. Like,
oh wow,
like it's not that far away, and that one was the utilization of melanin degrading enzymes. Like that was the study and utilization of melanin degrading enzymes, and it was on PubMed. And just reading about it,
it's so bizarre that we divide, like the way that our species, we divide ourselves into the races or whatever. All species have their races. I mean, the chimpanzees have little, this population here and that population there, just unique phenotypes that take hold in an isolated population. It doesn't mean that there's anything more unique about them than that, right?
Yeah, in fact, if you look at the chimpanzee Pantroglodytes subspecies, they are more different from each other than any two populations of humans. Humans are not that genetically different compared to chimpanzees, even because we're less isolated.
yeah.
Those chimp populations are really isolated, and our human populations have not been as isolated. Mostly.
There's been time periods where we were, though, and that's the bottlenecks that we've been through for different populations had bottlenecks that other ones didn't. I know you mentioned North America. That's quite a bottleneck there, right there in Beringia, right?
Yeah, but even there, the Asian and North American genetics are not that different compared to the other groups. But yeah,
the Aleutians and the Russian Eutics are. Yeah,
and Roland Brace pointed out Nadene and Ainu skulls are indistinguishable, and the genetics aren't that different. But if you go back in time, before that big bottleneck of modern humans, there were like bipeds that were like us, had brains like us, brain sizes bigger than ours or our size, typically more robust in musculature, in really isolated populations walking around, like Neanderthals, Denisovians, and whatever. And who knows how different they were. There's a lot of commonalities in the material culture, but we can't tell much from the stone. They might have been legitimate races in a sense. But you're right. All these sciencey, your point, right, is that what do scientists do? What do we do? And I think a lot of people don't understand that if you had to describe science in one very short way, people talk about the scientific method, that's not it. What science does is it observes variation, and then it tries to explain the variation with other variation you've also observed. That's what we do. And you see all the time, people take they take the averages or the means or the midpoints and talk about that like it was a thing, but it's not. It's the variation that matters with everything we do. So you can't tell this is a female and this is a male skeleton without saying, and I know how much they vary. And they overlap this amount. And so in this trait, they don't overlap much. In this trait, they overlap a lot. So I've only got the ulna. Ulnas are almost identical. They overlap a lot. So variation kills my suggestion that one's a male and one's a female. But when I look at the pelvis, they don't overlap much. So you're talking about variation. And everyone who thinks about science should remind themselves every time they do that, where is the variation? Where is the person pointing out the variation? And when you see a phys ed or whatever, phys.org article or some science writer's article on some science and they don't mention the variation or about anything, we need to do two things. Keep your numbers in context and observe the variation. So just now we learned that test scores on civics and history are down. Therefore, civics and history in America are ruined, right? Okay, number one, how far are they down? Hardly at all. Number two, are other test scores down this year because of COVID? Yes, all of them. So that news report, which was yesterday and it was on the news and it was an extensive conversation, is an irrelevancy.
Right? I feel like I'm right back in research statistics when you were just talking. I'm like, oh my gosh. Really quickly, as you were talking about that, a question came up and I thought it was relevant. Can you compare and contrast or see the deviation between humans and bonobos?
Between humans and bonobos?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is an interesting question because, first of all, people had a concept of what chimpanzees were and a concept of what humans were. And they're different. I'm talking about regular people, not scientists. And then bonobos were revealed to the world as a different phenomenon. And what was observed with bonobos is that they have intromissive sex, genital sex, and oral sex in every combination between every age and every gender and every form of sex except one. Little bonobo boys do not have sex with their mothers. Otherwise, everybody has sex with everybody else. Okay. So the bonobos became the sexy species. And since humans want to be also the sexy species, I thought we were the sexy species. How can they be the sexy species? So then it led to people to think, we descended from bonobos and not regular chimps. Okay. Because that's way sexier. Now, there's two things I would object to here. One is we actually are more closely related to common chimps because we think the ancestor of everybody was a common chimp, and bonobos definitely derived later. They emerged as a separate species around the same time that we did from Homo erectus. Okay, so they just came out later. Okay, so the evolutionary argument is no good. But I would also argue that variation matters. And what we see in gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos, the related African apes, shows you a range of systems, and any ape anywhere along the line could be anywhere in that range. And humans, chimps, and to some extent. So we can be the sexy species and be descended from sexy species that we can make up and imagine and don't know about. Okay. But then there's another fact that's really a wet blanket. If bonobos are the sexy species, never mind how they have sex, but just how much sex do they have? Do they have more sex than regular chimps? If you measure, this is what primatologists do, right? They watch the primates and they write down when they're doing something continuously for hours and hours. They've got video going, and this is what undergraduates do: is they watch a video and write down what they're doing at every moment for hours and hours. How much sex do regular chimpanzees have? Sexual, or let's say simian erotic encounters of any kind, not counting autoerotic, let's say. How much do bonobos have, and how much do chimps have? I've not read the latest literature, but last time I looked, they were the same.
They have the same amount of sex?
Same amount of sex, which is a lot. And that does not, I guess maybe, okay, that does not mean males impregnating females. That is very rare. That is very rare because what happens is, well, let's say, I guess I should rephrase this. Day to day, and day to day versus how much in total. You got to keep that in mind. Okay. So when a female pan-troglodytes is in estrus and receiving sex from males, everybody has lots and lots and lots of sex continuously all the time. And other times the chimps are not near each other. So they might have phone sex, but they can't have real sex because they're not anywhere near each other. They're separate. The mothers are with their babies. Otherwise, they're all separate. So the males get together in bro groups and go look for other males to beat up. Of course, that's what they do. They have the ultimate patriarchy. But even then, they're kind of separating. The females stay away from everybody all the time.
I have a question that kind of links on to this a little bit. Now we're talking about the differences between bonobos and common chimpanzees. Why are this is the question that's just been in my brain for so long. Why are bonobos considered a distinct species, but the eastern chimpanzee or billy ape that are considered to have these so much unique behavioral and even physical differences from other chimp populations still considered just another subspecies of common chimpanzee?
Why do you think?
Is there more genetic difference between bonobos and common chimps?
I think there might be, but I'm not sure that that's true. And I'm actually not. I don't know. You know, the genome data evolves, and I haven't looked at it.
Yeah,
lately, so I might be wrong. But I think it's because they had chimpanzees first, and they got bonobos later.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I think it's
so
just historical.
Whoever keeps the name keeps the name. You know, right?
Yeah, there could be 4 species of chimpanzees right now. It could divide. There are species that are that different that are considered different species. The northern oryx and the southern oryx is probably. I'd like to look at their DNA compared to chimpanzees. They're different species, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were less different than chimps because they've been separated for less time. So that's, I wouldn't. I'm not going to defend the current phylogeny.
Yeah, I just find the more research that they've been doing recently on the eastern chimpanzees, I just find it fascinating. So that's why I was wanting to drag that in here.
Yeah, and gorillas too. The Guarii subspecies is really different from all the other gorillas, but they're considered eastern lowland gorillas. But they live in mountains.
Yeah, they live more like the mountain gorillas, and their behavior like a bridge between the two populations live. Right?
That's but they're genetically with the lowlands. So yeah.
I guess that's just an example of niche partitioning on the population group dynamics, right?
Yeah.
This reminded me of a question that I had earlier. It just popped back into my head. Do all primates have some type of a culture, or is that not the case?
How would we define culture?
Well, that's a really good question.
Yeah, and so there's 2 really opposing definitions of culture, both of which work. One of them is the part of your typical or species specific activity that is not genetically determined, but it is genetically determined because you have maybe a brain or something. So there's genetics, but it gets learned. Okay, and if it gets learned, then you say, well, what about birds that learn how to do stuff from other birds? And then we get into learning, and did they learn it by watching? Did they learn it by being taught? That's a difference. For example, chimpanzees are known to teach their offspring. Other primate learning is because of observation only. So people worry about that. It gets you could do an advanced graduate seminar, 2.5 hours a week for an entire year on this question and never come to the end, right? Another feature, but within primates, the primatologists have defined culture in a really cool way, which makes it usable, simple. Stuff that varies inconsequentially, but still matters. So it doesn't matter, 2 chimpanzees want to be nice to each other a certain way, and they can groom each other, do various things. So the being nice to each other is the point, and that's what they must do. But how they do it, one group of chimps does it one way, a different group of chimps does it another way. And there's an arbitrary nature that's revealed when you watch enough, and you see there's behaviors that chimps do in one context that some group of chimps does for a certain reason, and the same behavior is done by some other chimps in another place for a different reason. One is a hand clasp, where the 2 individuals sit next to each other and hold each other's hands, and their hands go up, but their arms kind of intertwine. Okay, that's something that a parent does with an offspring, maybe in one group, but 2 males will do it in a different group. So they're doing the same kind of thing. Doesn't matter what they're doing. There's a purpose to it, and the purpose varies from different groups. That purpose must be met, but it could be met by grooming and picking lice, or it could be met by hand clasping. Among all the chimps, I don't know what the number is now, but there's 60 things that chimps do, and no group of chimps does all of them. Most don't do only a few, and with enough observation, it was discovered that over time, a group of chimps will lose something. They drop it off, stop doing it, and add something else in now and then. So they add and remove arbitrarily, randomly. So it's all important stuff, but it's the exact way so it's like language, right? Humans speak all different languages. We all have language is really important to us, but what language we speak is different. How do we greet each other? What is the meaning behind our greeting words, and how do we use them? Do we use them? And there are some cultures where most people just say something that's meaningless, like hello is meaningless. There's a meaning behind the word, but no one remembers it. Okay, we just say hi, how you doing? Okay, there are sets of cultures where people always greet each other with a reference to food. There's another set of cultures that I'm aware of where people greet each other with a reference to dominance and defeat. You have defeated the day. or I have defeated you. They say that kind of thing. And it doesn't mean anything to anybody. That's where the words come from. So we always have greetings, but the nature of the greeting is just, maybe there's an explanation for it. Maybe it's just arbitrary, and so that's culture, right? So yes, of course. So the original question was, what, do primates have culture?
Yes. Do all primates have culture?
No, I don't think so, because primates include a lot of primates that are solitary, or just monogamous pairs only, like almost all New World primates and prosimians together. They don't have much, so they have some behavior, but you need to have a group to have culture. You have to have stuff that's passed on. So
it does seem to be more prevalent in old world.
Yes.
Old world monkeys, minus the strepsirines and stuff. But did you see this paper on the where they researched those monkeys that were learned how to use seasoning by dipping their sweet potatoes in the?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I've met some of those monkeys. These are Japanese macaques, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. When I was actually doing the fire research, I went to Japan and did a lecture tour there, and I met the macaques that are at the Primate Institute it's out in the mountains somewhere, and they had just discovered fire. So what happened? They just discovered cooking. They independently discovered cooking. So it's a cold place. It's in the mountains in Japan, so it gets cold in the wintertime. Macaques are used to cold. But the scientists had built for some reason, they built a campfire in the macaque compound. And I think they did it to see what the macaques would do. And they would come by and get warm. And then one day, some macaque went over and cooked a potato. And then they all were cooking potatoes after that.
Oh.
At least the females were, because usually
I wonder if they did that because they saw a human doing it, or if they just
they didn't. They were raised in this cage in this.
Okay.
Never saw somebody. But that's a good question. I always had this argument with Ofer Bar Yosef, one of my advisors. He's an Israeli archaeologist. And he was always saying, "How do you know these chimps just didn't see?" Because there were chimps nutting, chimps using hammers to break open nuts, or using rocks to break open nuts. So how do you know they didn't just see a villager in the African village nearby doing it? And okay, so which do you want? A chimp that figures out to do it, or observes another species and adopts their behavior? I mean, either way is pretty cool, right?
Either direction you want to go, we got a lot to learn about it, right?
Right.
The way culture is passed on, interspecific cultural revolution.
Yeah, and meanwhile, we ask all these questions. Meanwhile, in the same research institute, there were chimpanzees, right? In this research institute, and there were these bars, these cages, these walkways. Were made of parallel bars in a cube, in a rectangular configuration. They put the chimp in there, and then the keepers were in the hallway, and they push the chimps along, and then they let them out in the room, and that's where they would do research on them, right? So the chimps kind of knew what to do, but there's something that had to be prodded a little bit to make them go. Every now and then they escape because they're getting into a room. Somebody forgets to lock the door. Every once in a while, there's a chimp in a hallway, free. These are dangerous animals, by the way. Chimpanzees are dangerous animals. Chimp, and the first time a chimp, or within the first few escape attempts, I'm told, the chimp went right for the elevator, and they pressed the down button and got into the first floor right away. And so they learned to use the elevator to go where they wanted to go. So they had to, and I was in this building, and they're explaining this to me, and we get in the elevator and say, "See, we're going to go to the 4th floor," so we press 1, because the chimps don't know about 1 versus 4. Like, they think 4 is the first floor. They get confused. So the humans have like a chart. You look up which button to press to get to the right floor. And they don't let the chimps see the chart.
Yeah. I wonder if the chimps could interpret from the chart.
Probably not. But I'll bet they would know, because they do bring the chimps into the elevator, like they're like in a harness. And they bring them in the elevator and go up and down. So the chimps are seeing the humans using the chart. They're seeing the humans pressing the buttons. That's how they figure out how to use the elevator. But they could easily know, they could probably learn when they press 3, that's where I want to go. They're just very smart. They're just really smart.
Yeah, dangerously smart, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So, what all primates have you worked with directly?
Humans. And then,
that's us.
And then since I worked with FA Pygmies, we ate monkeys.
Oh, you ate monkeys.
Yeah. So I was working with how they hunt monkeys and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, I've not worked with living primates. I've worked only with some extinct remains. So for example, and this is a primate project, Sciencey Melly, I can tell you about. At the University of Minnesota, my ex-wife's, Martha Tappan's father, Neil Tappan, who died a few years ago, he's the guy who went to the same area in Africa I worked in and figured out the species distributions and what species were there in 1954, 55, 56. And while he was there, because this is how you did it in those days, how you figure out which species is which, well, you shoot them. So they were there collecting primates. Mm. Okay, including, they also got some chimps, and they came across some gorillas that somebody had already collected. So the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, had this amazing collection of primate skeletons that Neil Tappan had created. And when Martha Tappan got her job, and she and I got hired at the same time to University of Minnesota, that's why I ended up in Minnesota, that collection came with us. And so University of Minnesota had this amazing collection. People come from around the world to study the teeth and the bones of well-documented primates of several species. Because this collection existed, it got added to. I added quite a bit to it. I collected 23 mammals from the Congo that had been butchered by pygmies. And I also got the permits to drive around Minnesota and pick up dead things. And that was fun. We had a facility to process of roadkill. So we had this huge collection, because, you use bones all the time in teaching, right? This huge teaching collection of bones. So a student, the forensic student I mentioned before, came along and wanted a project. I noticed every one of the primates every one of them, we took mangabees, or common mangabees from the Ituri forest, 2 species. Every one had been killed with a gun, right? So my question was, we know everyone was killed with a gun. Can you tell with everyone, or only some of them? Is there a bullet damage to a bone in how many times can you see the bullet damage? So Diana, my student, went through and looked at every bone and discovered 2 things. Amazing research. Number 1, yes, everyone has a bullet damaging a bone, every one. So if you're going to find a human being killed without a bone being damaged, that might be rare.
Definitely, okay. 100%.
Yeah, you hit the bones. You have to work hard to not do that, right? And then the other thing that was discovered, which is what we actually predicted in one of the main reasons of research, is that every female was hit from behind, and the largest males are all hit from the front. And the reason that this is a testing a hypothesis I proposed, because I had seen mangabees being eaten by monkey-eating eagles. And the way that happens is the monkey-eating eagle swoops in, and the females with their young all split, and the male stands up and defends everybody from the eagle, and eventually, of course, the eagle gets the male. So the 2 research projects we did was that one where Diana discovered that pattern of behavior where the males are standing up in front of the shooter and getting shot. And then in a Richard Wrangham site in Uganda, there was a monkey-eating eagle nest, and the eagle was eating mangabees. And they got the skeletons, and we got the skeletons, looked at them, and it turns out that they're all males, adult males.
Yeah.
So monkey-eating eagles eat adult males because those are the ones that basically volunteer.
That's the African crowned eagle, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And they are huge. Their claws, they have some of the biggest claws in the animal kingdom, I believe. Their talons. That's what they think killed the Tong child.
Yes, and I've held that fossil in my hands.
No way.
Yep, I met Phil Tobias. I met a bunch of times. I went to his lab, and he they had this big vault with a big thing you turn around like that, and they open it up and they pull it out. The assistant in the lab coat goes in and brings out the skull and the jaw, and he tells a story of how it was found. I had students with me at field school. Mm-hmm. He tells everyone the story. He points out the eagle marks on it. At one point, he talks about how the jaw was separated in order to see the teeth. The jaw was separated from the skull with a puff of dynamite. And then he's this older man. If you've seen him in pictures of him, he's an older man. He's a South African, British South African, and he's very distinguished and very British in his speech. And he's holding the skull in his standards form. You can see pictures. You just look up Tang and Tobias, you'll see him holding the skull on the internet. 1,000 pictures. And he says, the big question was, do you think I can talk? And he's moving the jaw up and down. And do you think I have language? And he's doing
that's got to be jarring.
yeah, it is. Doing the puppet thing with the actual original Tong skull,
Tell them about that fossil, though. Melly probably knows about it, but maybe Sunny doesn't. In our audience, may not, about what the Tong skull is. Since you got the hand.
Sure, right. Yeah, that's a good point. We're talking inside baseball here. So the South African Australopithecines. So the Australopithecines are early human ancestors, bipedal apes. They're small, and the first one discovered and identified was discovered by Raymond Dart. Is Australopithecus africanus in South Africa, and this is one of those in South Africa. And Tong is a site that's a native name for a site that was where mining was done. So in this region, you have a lot of evaporation. So evaporation means lots of minerals that are used for either fertilizer or for other purposes. And so this was a site where these minerals are being mined out with dynamite. And they were collecting baboon fossils and some other fossils from the area, collectors, and they discovered this one and brought it to Philip Tobias. And it was an early Australopithecine. And so imagine a butte, and on the edge of the butte, there's a cliff face, and behind the cliff face, there is a crevice forming. So the butte will eventually fall, the cliff will fall off. But before it falls off is a high spot on which an eagle nests, and you can find them like that now. And below the eagle nest in that crevice will be deposited all the pieces of the nest that fall off, and everything that the eagle kicks out of its nest.
Shells and bones and
all that stuff. So in this crevice are fossils of baboons, because this eagle's eating them, and some other things. And among those things, you get this Australopithecine skull, which inside the skull, where the brain would go, is a little tiny thing. It's a little baby Australopithecine. And inside the skull, there's layers of calcrete or like limestone, like stalactites and stalagmites. There's stalagmite layering. And from the top coming down are stalactites, and the bottom coming up are stalagmites, like a little tiny cave this big inside the skull.
It looks like geode. It's all sparkly and
it's a geode inside. Basically, a skull instead of a brain, there's a geode in there. And then there's a mark on the skull that looks like a talon of an eagle. And people argue about whether it is or not, but it's found in with the debris from an eagle nest. So
right.
It was eaten by an eagle for sure. I mean,
I don't think there's any doubt looking at it and what it was found with. I mean, like you said, there were other primate bones in there with it. It was a cache. Right. Maybe we don't know the species of eagle, but it's pretty. Yeah, that's how. Yeah, like you said, that's how the crowned eagles live. So on the cliff faces like that.
And in this case, I'm going to guess it might have been a martial eagle instead of a crowned eagle because that's where they live. But some big eground
something in that monkey predatory eagle niche. Yeah.
And by the way, the ground eagle doesn't bring the monkeys back to its nest whole because they're too big. It kills them, gets them on the ground, and it rips them into pieces. So I've seen that where I see it. I know there's an eagle around. I see a dead monkey. Come back later, there's half a dead monkey. Come back later, there's one leg. Come back later, it's all gone.
Like grabs piece by piece and takes it home, huh?
Yeah, it disassembles it and transport it piece by piece to it. And this is usually when, because they could eat it where it is, but what's happening there is there's a female. They differentiate their behavior a bit. There's a female with young in the nest, and the male is bringing back, provisioning both of them. The female kicks the male out and rips the stuff apart more and feeds the young until the young's full, and then
Yeah. Well, understanding and exploring ancient ecology is so amazing that you guys get to get your hands in some of these scenes and stuff like that. I know Melly, it's even like modern stuff you're getting your hands in, but
yeah, it's actually funny that you mentioned like the biologically sexual behavior of like primates, because it reminded me of a currently in Austin right now, that's where I am in Austin, we have like a potential serial killer kind of thing situation, and I was kind of looking into this, and it's crazy because that behavior between like men and women, it correlates to like this case and like a lot of serial killer cases. The majority of the time, like in society, women are typically like less likely to, get into a stranger's car and stuff like that. And a lot of men typically have the idea of like, oh, well, I could take them if they try to hurt me or take me down. And that seems to be the same type of behavior and this like the same like chain of reasoning behind like the primates, like whether the bullet was in the back or in the front, because it's just like the I can take them mentality is very much like correlating beyond just like human men and women.
Yeah. If you haven't read, have you read Homicide by Barton Daly and Margot Wilson? Yeah. Okay. So I have sat for them and I work with them a lot and knew them pretty well. And, you know, I remember being at a bar getting lunch or something at a hamburger shop, and something came on the news and they were just telling a story about somebody doing something bad. And Martin just said, it was a boyfriend. Like, yes, of course. The boyfriend killed his girlfriend's child.
Yeah.
That's just what happens. If a child dies through murder, it was usually the mother's
It's usually
new partner.
Like the majority of victims usually have like just within criminology in general. Right. Sorry, we're getting into this instead of primates. We'll go back to that in a bit.
It's still primates.
I'm a primate. These people are primates you're talking about. It's okay.
Yeah, exactly. And the majority of like criminology that you'll learn, the majority of victims will have like their offenders be someone that they know and actively trust. And like, that is typically what happens because those people have access to you like more often. Right. And so, and also like, it's very uncommon for you to just be like, oh, hey stranger, I'm going to completely trust you. Like, so it's very much a trend.
Well, that's very common in nature for animals to kill the offspring of previous seasons' males too. If a lion takes over their lion's pride, first thing they'll do is come in and kill the previous male's cubs, right?
Exactly. And primates do that. Yeah, I'm going to plug an author here that I just discovered recently. Her name is Jess Lowry, Lourey, and I'm plugging her because you have a serial killer down in Austin. Minnesota, like I think 10% of our population are serial killers. That's probably not true. But you see Coen Brothers movies, right? Like Fargo and all those movies. What people who don't live in Minnesota don't realize, because they're Minnesotans, right? What people don't live in Minnesota don't realize is that Coen Brothers are actually documentarians. Their stuff isn't so fiction, okay? I was sitting in an HOA board meeting recently, and the person in charge of the landscaping said, we got to rebuild the sign coming into the place. It's falling apart. And they said, I don't think it's been built since that guy who killed his family with the gardening equipment was here. It's like, what? Yeah. The person who used to contract our gardening, he got mad at his family and killed them all like with the wood chipper. It's like, this is like where I am right now. that was in the 80s. Anyway, the point is, Jess Lowry grew up in a context in which there were serial killers, and she kept running into these in her life, and writes about, basically her stories typically are about what it is like to be a young woman, a girl, who isn't, pre-sexual, pre-adolescent girl, the way she puts it is that race to womanhood, past all this shit that involve all these things. And you know what I'm talking about. And that's what she writes about. And it's fiction. And it's amazing. And there was a thing that happened here several years ago. A murderer was eventually caught. He killed Jacob Wetterling. It was fairly famous. There's like a foundation for him. The person who killed Jacob. And but Jacob was like the 15th person that this guy killed. And Jess Lowry, the author, has some link to that, which I haven't discovered yet because I haven't read that book she wrote yet. Unspeakable Things is that book. But her most recent book on, quote, Quarry Girls is about a community that actually existed in Minnesota, where a guy built a factory to build cars, and he built worker housing, and he built tunnels that go for every house in the basement has a door that leads to a tunnel. It goes to a tunnel system that leads to the factory, so people can go to work in the wintertime. And those factories, those tunnels were still there as people in recent times, and this is where all the weird shit happened in that town. You can imagine.
All right. So I just want to we're about just a little bit over an hour now, and I wanted to get just a few questions in before we wrap the show up tonight. So thank you guys so much for the lively conversation. It's been great. I think Kat's going to bring some stuff up for us here. I know Sunny's still having some in and out connection issue, but I'm glad she's been able to stick with us for this long, because this has been a delight to be participating in. We got one from our good friend Pat Lowinger. I'd be interested to hear about any current projects Dr. Laden is working on, if he is willing to discuss his work in progress.
Yeah, I'm actually not doing any anthropology work right now. I'm writing fiction, and I'm working as an educator. So I teach local high school students, and but what I do day to day. Okay, my main projects have been political. I've been very active politically. So my main projects recently were to change our city council from conservative libertarians to regressive radicals. I'm changing our school boards over. We're defending our local school boards. And I helped Minnesota get a trifecta of what we call DFLers in the House and Senate. So we're passing all these. We are now a trans refuge state, one of the first trans refuge states in the country. We have the PRO Act here for abortion rights. So Minnesota in the last 6 weeks has become the most progressive state in the country in terms of legislation, bar none. And that's because of all the work that me and about 200 other people have been doing for the last 3 years. So that's what I've been doing, is instead of anthropology and research, I've been doing political work. And for relaxation, I'm writing post-apocalyptic novels and that kind of thing, none of which are published.
Do you know P.Z. Myers?
Yes, I know him. Yes,
he's one of those Minnesota radicals. He's like one of my good friends. Yeah,
yes,
good guy.
My good friend. So he's a Minnesota radical, and he lives in the middle of nowhere in the western part of the state, where like there's a little tiny zone where most of the people won't kill you, surrounded by. Yeah, no, he's a great guy. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I'm in Illinois. It's the same thing. All little cities surrounded by a sea of red, if I put it that way. We just keep pushing, like you're saying, and that's a good message to kind of send out to our live chat too. Is each and every one of you, if you're up for the challenge, run for school board, run for city council, that kind of stuff. Those positions often run unattested. So if you're wanting to combat this, we just lost Missouri. I can't be trans in Missouri now. I can't cross the river, go 1 mile that way. Yeah. There's no health care for me. So just things like to think about like that.
And it's amazing. We passed a law that said anyone who has, if you're from Missouri and you're trans and you need some kind of medical thing, you can't get it there, but it's possible that Missouri would say you can't get it anywhere. So we have a counter law in Minnesota that says we will help anybody. It's illegal for anybody to do anything bad to anybody here regarding trans medicine or anything like that. So we're like, that's the most extreme law passed so far in the country. It would be the model for the rest of the country. People are going to pass it elsewhere. But I also want to say, people get annoyed, especially younger folks get annoyed with the political parties, like they're not doing enough, or they're too slow, or they're too whatever. My message there is just take them over. You can do that. That's what we're doing on my. I hope no one locally hears this, but we've got a lot of middle of the road, not quite woke districts where they're Democrats, but they're not really there yet. And we just go in and we get people who are local, and they say, just join them and start voting yourself in to be in charge. And that's how we got where we are now. We passed bills this last year that could not have passed 2 years ago.
I second that message 100% as someone a part of Gen Z. Like just overthrow.
It's not hard. It's not hard. You can actually just take over. You need 4 people, 5 people, because there's already people with you that are there. They're already there. Some of them are there already. So you just need like 4 more, and then you're in the majority in any group of political people.
And the radicals tend the radical movements or whatever tend to take hold in those local scenes, right? On the local level. That's how that movement, those types of movements get momentum. That's what we saw in 80s with the gay rights movements and things like that. Yeah. Wes, Kat, we got any more questions that we got for the panel tonight? All right, another one from Pat from Melly. Did you volunteer at a Romano British cemetery excavation?
No, but I apparently need to. I honestly I need to start like volunteering more at cemetery excavations in general, because honestly they're just not around here, like none. It's very locational, like it's locationally based most of the time on like the opportunities that you can get as a forensics science person in general. Like right now, even though I'm in Austin, it's like little to none. And I would have to go to like New York or Chicago to even most of the time get those opportunities. So
what's your goal? What's your ideal job?
My ideal job, I want to work as a crime scene investigator and go actually in the field of crime scenes rather than stay behind and be in a lab my entire life. I really like the intricacies of looking into a crime as it was left rather than, messing with the crime scene. And
right. So you want to get the big van, the big truck.
Yes. Which is morbid to say the least. Right.
No, that's great. That's a great aspiration. And that's a hard job. And I think it's a subset of forensics that not as many people are cut out for.
It takes a strong stomach, I have to say.
Yeah. And good knees.
Good knees, which is bad because even though I have good knees, I did break my foot like 3 months ago. So like,
yeah. Well, you get knee pads and stuff.
Get knee pads.
Take a lot of ibuprofen. It'll be fine.
What things were reserved mostly for primates to tell apart a different animal? Is there some common characteristics? So I think they're talking about what are the homologies that would make a primate a primate?
Yeah. Well, first of all, a lot of them are actually not good apomorphies. In other words, they're not good traits that are evolved in primates because primates are less evolved than most species of mammals. So they have a lot of bones. So where a lot of other mammals have far fewer bones in the limbs, primates retain most of the original mammal bones. So that's one
closer
thing.
To a basal state, yeah.
Yeah, post-basal state. And then, of course, they're mammals. Primates have a specific set of teeth, and there's 3 teeth patterns you find among primates, or 4, depending on how broad you define. The teeth. Okay, here's the problem. Primates differentiated into many groups early. So when you want to say what is it that defines a primate, the best way to answer that question is I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to say what defines a prosimian, what defines an old world primate, and what defines a new world primate as separate questions, because then there's nice coherent sets of things, like the tooth patterns are coherent. And then they have 4 arms more often. Some subsets do, like apes have 4 arms instead of 4 legs. Their hands and feet that have hands at the end of all 4 limbs for the apes. So it really depends on which subgroup you look at, right? But it's mostly primitive stuff. And then when you look at the skull, that's like overall. And when you look at the skulls, again, keeping prosimians and some primates aside, primates have large eyes that face forward and that are really well protected all around to some degree or completely in bone. If you look at this, if you're used to looking at human skulls, you look at a horse skull, it's like, where do the eyes go? They don't seem to have eye sockets because they don't. We have eye sockets. So the eyes are forward facing, and the eyes are set up to be, in an evolutionary sense, really good nocturnal eyes that have evolved into really good diurnal eyes in most of the primates, which have color vision of our particular kind.
Yeah, we owe our great eyesight.
Yeah.
We owe our great eyesight to our insectivorous ancestry, because those big insect hunting eyes.
Yeah. If you ever get a chance, wherever you are now, find your nearest zoos and see if they have tarsiers. If they have tarsiers, go and spend some time watching them. They might be just sitting there invisible most of the time, but take your time. Tarsiers are little. They have that big giant eyes that face forward. They're nocturnal. And they have a tarsal bone, which lets them spring. Tarsal bone is like the heel bone area. It lets them spring really quickly. If a human had that tarsal bone, we could jump over a big building in one leap, but we would also rip our legs apart the first time we did it. It doesn't scale up, right? But
square cube.
Yeah, but you look at a tarsier, and the enclosures and the zoos are always dark because they're nocturnal, and you'll see a tarsier sitting there, and all of a sudden it's gone. It disappears. They can vanish into thin air. And then you realize it's just jumped across the cage. But it jumped so fast you could barely see it. And while it was jumping, it grabbed an insect that was flying by at that time. So the ability to be a, what are this called? Patriot missiles. The ability to be a Patriot missile to an insect.
Yeah.
That's our main trait. Our main basal trait for primates.
That's where it all started. Chasing bugs. I'm still doing it. Most people have stopped, but
I see a question there. Did Grover Kranz ever figure out why we have eyebrows? He actually, I taught at the University of Minnesota, and he was there. He was the anthropologist at the University of Minnesota that was sure Bigfoot was probably real.
Oh, I know Grover Kranz. Yeah.
Yeah. And he did wear these eyebrows, these brow ridges over his eyes. Like he just put them on and kept them on like for a year.
For a year.
Before. I don't know if you came to any conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so if, here's a good question. If Bigfoot were a primate, what clade would you put it in?
Well, okay. It's got to be an ape. If you look at their pictures, right, they got long arms.
Mm-hmm.
The legs are long too, though. But so it's like humans have longer legs and arms, but we should have longer arms and legs if we're apes. So, but since they're bipedal, I'm going to figure I'd have to put it in really close to humans. So I put it in with hominins, maybe Homo.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you there. Only maybe Paranthropus, but
yeah. It could
something
kind of hominin. Yeah.
Something in that branch, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's see, we got some more questions out here. I know we do. Pat's been dropping some questions for us. Let's see here. Oh, I'm getting a little bit of echo. How is Austin these days?
And I did see that question. The Blanton Museum is still there, but Austin is very interesting, to say the least, on my side of things, just because, I mean, everyone hears there's a potential serial killer and or serial killer running around in like a very popular party street, and kind of like fear in everyone.
All right. Yeah. So closing statements, you all got anything coming up? Anything you want to plug? I know I actually liked ending on that political message that Greg had there, but yeah, let's go ahead and plug your content real quick, Melly. She's on TikTok. She's a super TikTok star. I follow her. Why aren't you following her? Tell them about it, Melly.
I have a TikTok where I talk about everything from forensics to general science to explain, how science works. But my forensics channels are series that include is that a good way to get rid of a body, and could that kill me, among other things that I should probably not tell the general public about, but going to anyway. It's public knowledge anyway, it's okay. But I'm also on Instagram, and I post more science content on there, stemming anywhere from advocating against misinformation about climate change, that is something that I just posted about, all the way to political decisions based around environmental legislations. So
great.
Excellent. All right, Greg, anything last minute you want to plug before we
No, I don't think so. I do write on Greg Laden's blog, but I don't write much these days, but I do still write there. I'll probably be inspired by this conversation to write something.
Absolutely. I love that we could inspire you to write something. I know you're writing fiction stuff too, so I'd like to hear more about that at some point.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We can. Well, there is a book called The Search for Sungudogo, Sungudogo. That is that's in print at Amazon. And it's about the search for an ape that is not known to science, but some people think it might exist. And it turns out to be, it's science fiction that turns out to be a parody of the skeptics movement.
All right. Yeah. That sounds like a nice little twist on that. Yeah.
I wrote it by writing a chapter every day for the student, Skeptic Student Alliance. Mm-hmm. The Secular Student Alliance fundraiser. So I wrote a chapter a day, and then after that, revised it a lot because that wasn't very good. One chapter a day doesn't get a good novel, but I revised it a lot. But it's set in Central Africa. It's set in the Congo, and it's about to search for this ape that may or may not exist, and ends up explaining the origin of the skepticism movement in a satirical manner.
All right. Well, I want to give a quick shout out and thank you to our patrons today. We got Eric Ozols, Tara S., Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dan D., Michael Wiseman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Cadell. I always mess up his last name, Calderone. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the sunny spot today. You know, I end my shows by saying this. Please remember to be kind and take care, and we will see you next time.